This is Law with Charlie, hosted by Charlie Medcalf. This is your podcast and YouTube channel for all things law, legal academia, and qualifying as a barrister.
Hello and welcome to this latest podcast, Law with Charlie, with me, your host, Charlie Medcalf. And in this episode, I'm going to be introducing you to my employment law podcast revision series. And so this accompanies my YouTube lectures, which you can find on my YouTube channel, Law with Charlie. And so in this video, as I say, I'm going to just introduce you to employment law and this revision series and go through some of the topics which I will be discussing over the course of this employment law revision series. And so firstly, just some general information. This podcast, a bit like the PowerPoints lectures on my YouTube channel, are for consolidation and revision rather than a replacement from your actual lectures. And why am I doing this in particular? It's because I like to revise as much as possible, but I also like to do other things like long distance walking or other stuff. So when I'm doing things where I can't sit down and do readings, such as long distance walking in general, washing up, cooking, etc., etc., I like to be able to listen to podcasts like this. I understand that it may not be active revision, but it's going to be passive revision, and so I'm hoping, because of the way I work, my brain works when it comes to exams and assessments and all that, I don't feel like I retain the information, but then once I get to the exam room, I do. I remember it all. And so this is really passive revision, so I'm still getting familiar with the content, even though it's not active. And so that's one of the main reasons why I am doing these podcast series, because I've found a gap. There's very little, if any, podcast revision series for employment law, medical law, law of evidence, or even family law. Sorry, I had a bit of a forgetful moment just then. And so yeah, I'm basically recording the kind of podcasts which I would like for this area of law. And so let's go move on now and go straight to the key substance of this podcast series, which will reflect quite largely my YouTube series. And so firstly, there will be a bit of an introduction to the employment law topic, and this will be looking at the historical development of employment law. So why do we have employment law? How did employment law come about? Before then, looking at the sources and institutions of employment law. So that will be the various acts of parliament, case law, and the ACAS codes of practice, for instance. Then there's institutions like the Employment Tribunal, the Employment Appeals Tribunal, or the EAT. There's the normal courts, there's ACAS, and there's much more as well. Once we've done a bit of that introductory topic, we'll be moving on to employment status. Now, when it comes to employment status, we'll be looking at the different types of employment status, and we will have a particular focus on both employee status and worker status, but we will also have a bit of a look at the different atypical statuses. So, for instance, 0-hour contracts, agent workers, Uber drivers, for instance. As I'm sure you're aware, there's quite a lot of case law in this area. But no, there's some really important case law in employment law, and particularly the law on employment status, which concerns Uber. For instance, there's Uber and Aslam. Or it might be the other way around, Aslam and Uber. But then, once we've looked and considered employment status and the various tests for different statuses, so see if they satisfy the employee status, and if not, apply the tests for worker status and see if they satisfy the tests for worker status, sorry. We will then go on to the terms and conditions of employment. And so this will look at both the employment contracts and the terms and conditions of employment. And in particular, when we get to the terms and conditions of employment, we'll be looking at the various implied terms which are implied into contracts of employment. So, for instance, mutual trust and confidence, then obviously mutuality of obligation and all of that stuff. But we will also look at some of the key implied rights which many workers' employees have. And this will, in particular, include the national minimum wage, national living wage, paid time off, sick leave, but also the working time regulations and the law about night working, annual leave, sick leave, and all of that stuff. So that's going to be the areas we focus on for terms and conditions of employment. Then, after that, moving on, we get to go to the dismissal and business reorganisation unit. And so here, there are a number of things which we will be looking at. We'll be looking at the different types of dismissal, so unfair dismissal, constructive dismissal, etc. Also transfers of undertakings, very, very briefly, and we will be looking at TUPE in brief detail as well as employment dispute resolution, so the different resolutions there are for employment disputes in terms of dismissal and business reorganisation. And if I may say so myself, this is actually quite a interesting area of law. But then following dismissal and business reorganisation, we go into equality law, which is another nice area of employment law. And when we come to equality law, much of it is going to be based on the Equality Act of 2010. And that's not an employment specific act, that is the England and Wales's overall general equality legislation. But we'll be looking at it in an employment context, and as such we will also be looking at the relevant employment equality law case law as well, to see how the courts have applied the Equality Act to employment cases. One of the areas of equality law here will be maternity and paternity leave, which we will focus briefly on, but we won't be focusing too much on this area in this topic, because we will be discussing this in even more detail in our next topic. Talking of which, our next topic is the reconciliation of work and family life. And so this is essentially how individuals can balance both work life and family life, and essentially for both parties of the family to contribute to the economy and their workplace and earn a living, whilst also staying behind and doing their domestic duties at home. And so essentially this is where we aim to move away from the traditional approach where in the case of a family, the father/husband would be the bread maker going out to work and providing for the family, whereas the mother would be their homemaker, housewife. He would care for the children, do the cooking, do the house chores, and all of that. And so, in reconciliation of work and family life, we explore the laws of balancing that out so it's not just left to one person or the other, and that both the husband and the wife, mother and father, can both work and both engaged in the domestic activities. And so as such we'll be looking at maternity and paternity leave and pay, pregnancy leave, and so on and so forth. Once we have looked at topic 6, there's the next topic is again very much related to the Equality Law, the Equality Act, and human rights in particular. And this is the topic of freedom of association. And here we'll be looking at the human rights of freedom of association, and in particular we'll be looking at the right to join a trade union in employment, which is a fundamental right for those who are employed, unlike self-employed individuals who often aren't part of trade unions, although many are increasingly becoming part of trade unions. But then once we have looked at freedom of association and trade unions, we move on to collective bargaining. And so this is, rather than bargaining with the employer as an individual, is where trade unions often bargain on behalf of the individuals who are part of their union. And so they come together as a collective, because the collective is more persuasive than the individual. And we're going to look at how the trade unions can influence employers, and again the various legislation around this area. We will then go on to one of the particularly interesting topics, which is industrial action. And so we will then be considering the law on strikes and what makes a strike lawful, including the process which trade unions must undertake before strike action, the obligations of the trade union and members during the strike action, and also after strike action. Then we move on to worker participation, so worker participation in decision making and so on. And then finally we finish the employment law series off looking at human rights and employment law. So we will look at the various human rights which are available largely under the European Convention on Human Rights, which has been incorporated into the law of England and Wales in the Human Rights Act 1998, if I remember correctly. And we'll be looking at how those human rights in particular apply to employment law. And then yes, that will then form the complete series for which you can then use for revision. So I hope you have found this introductory episode interesting and valuable. If so, please do subscribe/follow this podcast so you don't miss any of my other episodes, and have a listen to some of my other episodes as well, particularly my Save Our Jurors series, which I'm quite impressed with, if I may say so myself. But also please do go over to my YouTube channel as well, Law with Charlie, where you will be able to find various lectures with presentations, advice videos, YouTube shorts, and all sorts of other law revision and other such related stuff as well, which might be useful. And if you do go onto my YouTube channel, please do like, comment and subscribe as well, because that will encourage me to do more content like this, as well as more content on YouTube. And potentially most importantly for this podcast, please do write a review for this podcast, because if I see these reviews, it's going to encourage me and motivate me to do more of these podcasts, and I will see that I've got an audience. But also, if you write good reviews, other people will see these reviews, and then they will start making use of these podcasts as well. And that's what I need, because it can be difficult to find these podcasts, especially when arguably there might only be a small audience. For instance, law students who have chosen these modules, particularly when it comes to employment law, with it not being a foundation of legal knowledge topic, and for me an optional topic. And so yeah, if you could leave a review, like, comment, subscribe and follow, that would be absolutely excellent. But that is all for now, and I thank you all for listening this far in, and I very much look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Law with Charlie, with your host, Charlie Medcalf. Please do ensure that you leave a comment below either to just say hello or ask a question. And please like, subscribe, and leave a review for more content like this. See you next time.